We will hear argument this morning in case 2512.
The grievances we could go into with this system, I think we could be here for hours.
National Collegiate Athletic Association.
I think we have some proof, even a few years into NIL now, that people care about the logo.
There are too many people in power who have no desire to give up that power.
The NCAA's ever-shifting decisions, not stable decisions.
Does the concept of amateurism in college athletics even matter anymore?
They've capped it again without any sort of collective bargaining.
We'll finish with our unilateral decision. Welcome back to another episode of Unilateral Decisions. Today we're talking something that is near and dear to me. Sports broadcasting is what brought me back to Boise and Boise State. So very appreciative for all things sports broadcasting. But today we're talking the Sports Broadcasting Act of 1961. Sam, take me back to 61. Streaming wasn't a thing. Pay-per-view wasn't a thing. Cable wasn't a thing. So why did the Sports Broadcasting Act come into place, and what was its initial purpose?
Well, what I'll do in explaining that is actually take you even further back from 1961 to 1953, which is when the United States Department of Justice, on behalf of the United States, filed a lawsuit against the NFL, saying that their joint broadcasting agreement, all the teams kind of coming together to sell one television broadcast to one particular network, violated antitrust law. And for viewers of this podcast, you may remember a case called maybe a little case you maybe haven't heard of called Board of Regents, NCAA Board of Regents. And it was essentially the same theory. It was the idea that, when you have this big group of competitors that instead of selling their television rights one by one, where Alabama has an individual television rights deal where they're competing with Ohio State and they're competing with Auburn and they're competing with all these other schools, they decided to just collectively pool them. That's an antitrust issue. It's a competition issue. It's something that harms not only for consumers who get less access to their favorite games and fewer games on television a lot of the times, but also harms the broadcast companies as well, because all of a sudden they don't have access necessarily to this if you have exclusive rights. So back in 1953, the Department of Justice was able to get this injunction, and that led a few years later, they lobbied and they successfully made a case to Congress that they needed antitrust exemption to this. And that led to the Sports Broadcasting Act, which exempts, it's actually more of a compromise. It contains a lot of kind of additional elements to it. But the big thrust of it is that it exempts, league sports broadcasts and football, hockey, baseball, and basketball from antitrust law, so that you can have pooled television rights. So, the NFL's deals with CBS and Fox and ESPN and all that can work because of the Sports Broadcasting Act. So with college athletics, it's conference by conference. Then you've got the postseason. So walk me through, Mike or Joe, right now, how college athletics has been acting differently than professional sports and how they negotiate their broadcast rights.
Yeah, Sam touched on Board of Regents. We talked about it at length in our first episode of this podcast. The Board of Regents decision basically confirmed that the NCAA did not have the same benefit of the Sports Broadcasting Act. And so they've divided out their broadcasting rights, and they do it at the conference level. And that allows for them to, have competition in the market and allow different broadcasters to bid on those rights differently. And there's enough kind of players in the game at the conference level. And so the schools pull them together for conferences to work through. And, we've seen through this age of realignment where, you've got grants of rights, and that's essentially broadcasting rights. That's essentially what the schools are pooling together and saying, yep, I am locking ourselves in to this group of universities, and we are collectively saying, go put our broadcast rights on the table together. It's one of, if not the most valuable thing right now that schools have to sell, and they pull it at the conference level, and the different conferences go out and they're on different schedules, and it allows for some competition in the market. So that's really the biggest difference.
And the reason we're talking about this right now is because there's an argument to be made that instead of just pooling conference by conference, if you took everything that's available and put it in one pot, that there's a lot more money to be made for schools, which would help offset what this new budget line item that every institution has, via rev share.
And Joe, you mentioned before all the research you've done into this. The more you learn, the more questions you have. So what has stood out to you as being the most ridiculous part of all of this?
I mean, it makes my head explode because everything Sam just talked about, you're going back to 1961 when everybody was watching one of 3 channels in black and white and your remote control was the youngest kid in the family room, right? Like,
I think we were a little past black and white at that point, but
I wasn't there, so I'm assuming that's what it was. But it also only includes over the air, and nothing is. Virtually nothing is over the air. And they talk about 20% of the country has an ability to put an antenna, and get things over the antenna. Well, it's probably more than 20%, but nobody's watching anything. So this act is so outdated that people talk about being able to pool the rights together, but that might be an antitrust issue, but it's based off of an act that is so old that it doesn't even make sense in modern times.
Yeah, that's what I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's one thing I left out of my synopsis because I figured we'd get to it later. But Sports Broadcasting Act was passed in 1961. It explicitly only covers over-the-air broadcast rights. It does not cover cable. It does not cover streaming. Certainly doesn't cover streaming. Nobody contemplated the idea of broadcasting games over the internet in 1961 because the internet wasn't a thing back in 1961. And the NFL and other professional sports leagues have lobbied for a change to this to allow for those rights to be covered, but they haven't gotten it. And that's actually led to lawsuits. The NBA got sued back in the 80s. The Houston Astros got sued back in the 80s for radio. Major League Baseball and the NHL got sued over streaming, MLB TV, NHL TV. The blackouts in the 2010s, it ended in a settlement. And by the way, I should note, so if you maybe thinking, oh, Major League Baseball, why are they in there? They have antitrust exemption. Actually, a court held in that Lauman case in 2012 that because Major League Baseball was named in the Sports Broadcasting Act, that Congress's intention was for them to not their antitrust exemption to not cover this. So we're not even talking about the baseball exemption here, which is this very narrow exception. And more recently, so you may have heard of this, the NFL, when we're talking about DirecTV and NFL Sunday Ticket, which was on DirecTV for a long time and exclusively on DirecTV for a long time, that led to a $4.7 billion jury verdict. The jury verdict was reversed, but it's currently on appeal. So that makes it abundantly clear from all those different cases that courts look at the SPA and read it very, very narrowly as, this only applies to over-the-air broadcast agreements. It does not apply to cable, streaming, anything else like that.
That takes us to today, unless, Mike, you had something to add.
I'm ready to talk about today.
Today, billionaire Cody Campbell has a plan that's going to save college athletics. What is that plan, and what is he hoping to amend with the Sports Broadcasting Act?
I think this is where it gets into a lot of what Joe was bringing up and the details that Sam talked through, is that on its surface, the argument sounds good. Amend the Sports Broadcasting Act to allow NCAA athletics and the NCAA at large to pool its broadcasting rights. As was just discussed here in this aside, it would require a lot more amendments in order for it to have any weight, because when you look at what so many of those rights holders are cable. They are cable and streaming. That's what exists at the collegiate level for the most part. Obviously, there's over-the-air broadcasts, but it's usually because one of the conglomerates has decided they want to put a small fraction of those broadcasts on over-the-air network TV. And so in order to, the headline is kind of amend the Sports Broadcasting Act to allow the NCAA to have the same privileges as these professional sports league counterparts. The reality is that it would require a lot of amendments that would include far-reaching implications of professional sports as well, and would change the landscape and the complexion of what the Sports Broadcasting Act really is and really covers, in order for it to actually have the benefit that he's purporting. And so I think that for the purpose of this conversation, to just kind of definitively say what they're asking for is the ability for, like Joe said, collegiate institutions and conferences collectively to then pool their rights to be able to sell those at conceivably a higher dollar figure, which we can get into that discussion here in a second. But that's what they're asking for. And that's what Cody Campbell's plan is to be able to say the NCAA needs to be able to do the same thing that the NFL does and allow these individual entities to pool their rights together so that they can share the revenue from those, to where his beloved Texas Tech in Lubbock, if they were left to their own devices to go negotiate their own contract, would be vastly different than Michigan or Notre Dame or you name it, that has this gigantic national following, that lives in a really, really big market. And if they were competing individually, that would be a lot different. And so the ability for Texas Tech to then pool their rights alongside Ohio State and UCLA and USC and be able to share in that equally is what they're all pushing for.
Yeah, and the reason why this conversation is particularly important today is because, aside from being this massive Texas Tech booster, a member of the Texas Tech Board of Governors, Cody Campbell also has the ear of the president. He is probably President Trump's lead advisor on college sports, and saving college sports has become a big priority issue for the president, and that's led to the idea that some sort of SBA amendment, some sort of revenue sharing is going to be part of whatever bill they pass, if they do pass any kind of bill. And, the SCORE Act is, as we're recording this, the SCORE Act is now dead. I mean, it's been dead before. It may not be dead for long, but it is dead. It just got, it just lost its only two Democratic co-sponsors. The Congressional Black Caucus is unanimously against it. It's dead. But we have another bill potentially that's being negotiated between Senators Cruz and Cantwell, who are very much on opposite ends of the political spectrum and trying to bridge that gap, where I think it's safe to assume that some sort of SBA amendment and revenue sharing is going to be part of that if it does come to fruition. Because if you read the tea leaves, if you look between the lines, and as soon as the SCORE Act started to look really iffy, you saw a bunch of statements from the President's Roundtable on College Sports. You saw statements from all the different conferences, except for two conferences.
Which two conferences are those, Sam?
I wonder. Maybe the Big Ten and the SEC, because they're the ones who have very much come out against revenue sharing for obvious reasons, because the Big Ten and the SEC are currently knocking on the door of $100 million per school per year, and they don't want to share revenue with schools that are looking at closer to $25 million per school per year.
Or less. Significantly less. I mean, I could see why they wouldn't want to have anything to do with revenue sharing, but on the whole, there's a lot more people that would benefit from it. But that's where, in reading through this, I keep coming back to everything that confuses me. Like, you talked about blackouts, and you talked about it doesn't cover streaming. Like there are blackouts now. There are games that NBC is getting just to put them on Peacock. Like all of this stuff is happening, and I don't know if it's not covered by this act. Why is that not an antitrust violation?
And the answer is it is. We've actually seen in recent months that the Federal Communications Commission has opened up investigations into professional sports league practices over. Like I remember recently, I'm a San Diego Padres fan, and when the Padres played the Cardinals, it was a 4-game series on 4 different networks, and that's infuriating as a fan because you have to have subscriptions to all 4 of those networks. And yeah, the FCC has opened an investigation. The DOJ has opened an antitrust investigation. It would not shock me to see private litigation in that space in the near future. It's a ticking time bomb. It is, and I would imagine that whatever SBA amendment they contain related to college sports does cover cable and streaming. Because obviously if they, just say, okay, well, the NCAA is part of the SBA now, the NCAA is going to look at it and say, okay, I guess that gives us the ability to negotiate with ABC and CBS and NBC, and it's going to be really weird because we can negotiate with ABC and not their parent company, ESPN, Disney. So I don't know how that would work.
Yeah, and so just to put a practical bow on it, if we're talking about the same thing, we talked about this right before we came on air, if the NCAA was included in the current SBA and they were able to go out and have these discussions, if they pulled their rights and ended up with ESPN as the high bidder, it would be conceivable that someone could challenge that agreement on the grounds of the Board of Regents ruling that says that the NCAA can't do that. And the only exemption that the Sports Broadcasting Act would provide is network TV.
Correct.
And so as currently written, a massive revenue sharing agreement with a streamer or cable TV provider wouldn't actually be covered by the Sports Broadcasting Act. So additional amendments would be required, which I think that putting myself in the shoes of a Supreme Court in 1961 or Congress in 1961 is that part of the rationale for the narrow scope of the SBA is that on free TV, it is not necessarily impacting the consumer, and they're not getting price fixed out of being able to consume what they're looking for.
Correct.
Because it is sponsored television as written, sponsored broadcast because it's paid for by advertising. So if it was amended to include cable, satellite, streaming, which would essentially be required in order for the NCAA to even benefit from being a part of this, and then the NFL, the NBA, the MLB, the NHL turns around and says, okay, well, we're good now too, that becomes more of a consumer price fixing issue because of the cost of watching TV and watching these games. Is that
no? That's a really, really good point, and actually something I didn't even think about. And I think a big reason why you might not see it, because for one, like an NCAA deal with even all three broadcast over the air television networks does not make a remote bit of sense, because they just don't have the inventory to carry all these games. I mean, even if you just convert them to being, all college sports all the time, how many games can you actually broadcast on one network? It's not that many. And they also have other things that they want to broadcast as well, presumably, and certainly, which is why you don't see that many games on ABC. You see a lot of them on ESPN or ESPN2 or ESPNU or ESPN Plus or all these other things. But you're absolutely correct, because I can go out and, go on Amazon or go to, home improvement store or anything like that and buy a satellite for $20 and be able to get ABC, CBS, NBC. Can't do that with cable. And if you look at, the example I gave with Major League Baseball, and this is true for all the different networks. I mean, if you look at all the different professional sports leagues, if you look at the NFL, for example, they're starting to put games on Amazon Prime, and they're putting games on Netflix, and they're putting games on YouTube, and they're doing all these different things that require consumers to have subscriptions to up to a dozen different of these streaming services, and it becomes a major consumer issue. And that's exactly what the DOJ and the FCC are looking at. And to assume that you can do that with college sports, and I think kind of ignores that key fact and ignores kind of the reality of what the world we live in and how difficult it is to be a sports consumer in the world we live in. And yeah, I mean, I think that's a really great point. And also, if you weren't going to given the inventory issue, if you weren't going to include streaming and cable, I'm guessing that deal with ABC or CBS or NBC would not be that lucrative, because they what value are they getting out of it? Or just getting a few games a week.
I mean, that right there brings up a couple points. One, if those stations turned into all college sports all the time, if West Coast schools think they hate kick times now, wait till we're kicking at 1 a.m. But two, I mean, there's a question on whether or not that value that's being, purported even is even real.
Yeah.
And based on everything you just said, like, there is value. Like, that is where people are actually watching live sports. Mm-hmm. Like, that is where people are watching. And these entities are paying premiums for this content because they want people, downloading and subscribing to whatever platform they have. So it's feasible that there is actually revenue that, if pooled together, would make a gigantic impact on athletic departments. But based on everything I've heard you say, none of it sounds like it's legal.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. It's at least not legal under the current law. But yeah, I mean, the reason why NBC pushes games on Peacock is because they want you to subscribe to Peacock and, realize, I can watch The Office and Parks and Rec on here. I'm going to keep subscribing to it instead of just getting this for a day so I can watch, this Notre Dame game.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's the same reason why Netflix is getting into the market. That's the same reason why YouTube's getting into the market, because they feel like they're able to sell subscriptions using this, and they are able to sell subscriptions using this. But you are 100% correct that the current iteration of the SBA does not actually protect any of that.
How about another kind of practical application to see if this would fly? Theoretically, let's say they amend the Sports Broadcasting Act to allow the NCAA to be a part of it, but for all the reasons we just talked about, streaming cable's not included in that. Theoretically, could the NCAA and all of its conferences together, at least the Power Four conferences together, come and say, we're going to create a package of the top games from each conference that the NCAA is going to sell to an over-the-air network, and then the conferences go from there and sell their remaining inventory as they have been in the past? Is that potentially an outcome? And is that an outcome legally? And then financially, as somebody who's been involved in all of these conversations from conference and school levels, what's the value of that for the NCAA, the conferences, and the schools involved?
You could absolutely do it legally, for sure. I mean, there's nothing. I mean, assuming again an SBA amendment,
right.
You could certainly do it. It wouldn't be obviously it wouldn't be an antitrust issue because it's now exempt, but wouldn't be an issue in any other way as well. Aside from, and you'd be, the Big Ten and the SEC would tell you that you'd be breaking some contracts, but assuming you wait until those contracts are done, then yeah, for sure.
I mean, it's not just primary rights. I mean, there's secondary rights, there's, third tier rights, and at every level there's value. My question is just, how do you get to the point where all of this is legally permissible? Like what? Because if you amend what's there now to include these things, like it sounds like it would still be price fixing if you're giving everything away. So how do you get to the point where this becomes legal so that you can then capitalize on every dollar that is available? Because there is value there.
You pass the bill through Congress, which
once again,
is easier said than done, as we all in college sports have learned quite conclusively over the past several years.
You guys are talking about the consumer aspect to it, and I subscribe to all the streaming services so I can watch the teams I want to watch, which is maddening. It takes way more out of my budget than I'm comfortable with. But as a consumer, legitimately, why are my rights to watch sports different than any other piece of content out there? Why does the consumer factor in when you consider all these different subscriptions? Why? I mean, you're talking about it like it's potentially a legal issue. Why is that? And why, as a consumer, do I have any right to watch what I want to watch?
It's the competition element.
Yeah.
And it's all those other broadcast or production houses that put together anything that's on Netflix, anything that's on Hulu. By and large, there's enough competition in the market for them to take their product somewhere else, or for the other streaming platform to get a similar product. And they can say, you're making the choice. You as the consumer are making the choice to subscribe to which different platform because you want which particular product or show or what have you. But on an individual basis, those shows and those production houses are competing against each other for the placement on that streaming platform and for your eyeballs. And if you pool everything from a sports standpoint, you're restricting the competition, you're limiting the competition, and you're not giving the consumer any choices.
Couldn't have said any better myself.
Let's go.
One of the other things we talked about, the feasibility of this, you have to get everyone to sign off. Those that are making the money are not going to sign off on it, which is understandable. But in addition to that, you've got Brett Yormark, the commissioner of the Big 12, said there would be unintended consequences if this were to happen. What are those unintended consequences outside of these big-time schools making less money feasibly?
Honestly, not 100% sure. I mean, I imagine there could be unintended consequences. I don't doubt on that. It's hard to kind of imagine what they are because they're, perhaps unintended. And but I would think a lot of it is probably in part related to the economics are not clear. Like I think, as in many things in economics, if you asked three economists what they thought about whether they thought that this would actually be more lucrative than splitting it per conference. You'd probably get one say yes and one say no and one say maybe. Because that's just the reality of the situation. We don't know. We can look at the NFL and say, well, they have pooled broadcasting rights and they're making a ton of money and they're making more money every year. So clearly that means that the same thing would go to the NCAA, but we don't have anything to really compare to because the NFL, it's not like we have an alternate reality that we can look at where the NFL doesn't have pooled broadcasting rights and they sell it by school instead. And you can compare it and say, well, it's Major League Baseball sells it per team and they make significantly less money. And it's like, well, the NFL is a more lucrative product than the Major League Baseball. And I say that as a big baseball fan. We just don't have that. And I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to pretend like I know the answers. But again, I feel like a lot of economists would tell you that they don't know the answers either.
My theory is that to get that changed, like you said it, Sam, it would require Congress to get involved.
It definitely would.
So unintended consequences for me is likely now Congress is involved and they're going to get involved in other areas of setting the stage for what college athletics is going to look like moving forward.
That could definitely be true because like I mentioned that the SBA at the start of this, I mentioned that the SBA also contained some compromises. I didn't really explain what they were. The compromises were that in order to have this protection, the NFL specifically, professional football specifically, can't or any games that they broadcast on a Friday night is not covered as long as it's within, I think, like 75 miles of a high school or something like that, or it's some very specific kind of thing. But there's allowances for to protect high school football in there, and it wouldn't shock me if they had something similar for, especially given the consumer protection issues that we've talked about, and it wouldn't shock me if there's something similar in any kind of congressional act where maybe they pass an act that covers all the NCAA, covers streaming, covers cable, but says this only applies to one broadcast agreement. You could sell it to one company, and you can't require consumers to have not only ESPN Plus but also Peacock and Paramount Plus and Apple TV and Netflix and YouTube and etc.
Yeah, and I think the other piece of ceding control as an unintended consequence, you pull all your rights together, you all of a sudden, as a league, there's a pecking order. We all know that. You mentioned if it's all consolidated onto over-the-air TV, you got to get used to crazy kick times. If you're the Big 12 and you're consolidated into one broadcast agreement with the SEC, with the Big 10, you better get used to a lot of Wednesday and Thursday kicks across your league, or you're just not going to be at the top of the pecking order. And so I think that you are giving up control. You're giving up control to Congress. You're giving up control to your competitors right now to allow them to then dictate what you're doing. Whereas right now, when you're going out and you're negotiating, it's part of what you can stand on as a league and say, you know what, we're not going to take the deal from CBS because they have so much inventory that they're asking us to be a secondary, tertiary part of their package. They want us to play most of our games on Friday. They want us to play most of our games on Peacock, like whatever. And you can make the decision not to because you're negotiating and you're competing. And if you give that up and you're pooled, you'll figure out real quick where you stand.
Well, it's not just TV rights if Congress is getting involved either. I mean, we're talking about now, donations to your university foundation are no longer tax deductible. There's student athletes are now employees. Like if Congress is involved in setting the stage for you, you're losing the voice that you had, which is why we always talk about collective bargaining probably being, even though it's going to be difficult, probably being
we almost got through an episode.
Yeah, I know. We couldn't let it happen. Got to talk about it. You let other people dictate what it's going to look like for you. You might not like how it comes out.
Politics.
Different type of collective, the collective rights, which we're talking about today. There's a bit of a framework already with the NCAA and postseason, right? So apples and oranges, but that's collective. Everyone's involved in that bucket. The NCAA is the one negotiating that. But whether it's CFP, NCAA basketball tournament, how does that framework currently work? And is that a model that you could apply to this scenario where we're all pooled together?
The reason why that's able to work is if you look at the Regents decision, the Supreme Court was clear that there are certain products that require collective action to exist at all, and playoffs are part and parcel. They're first and foremost kind of the big thing here. So, playoff agreements, broadcasting agreements are not covered under the Sports Broadcasting Act for college sports, obviously, because none of it is covered. But it's also not going to be an antitrust issue because you need to have that joint venture to do it. You need to have it controlled because you don't know necessarily what teams are going to be advancing on, and they can't sell their broadcast rights ahead of time. And so you need to be able to do that. And so, that's something that works, something that's allowed, something where, obviously the NCAA has been selling March Madness television rights for years now, and there's never been any trust issue with it, and it's fine. But that would not be able to apply to the regular season. That wouldn't be applied to scheduled games because so it would not be able to be a model for kind of being able to do it without the SBA amendment because you don't necessarily need to have that joint venture. You have to have obviously coordination between two schools because you have to have a game, but you're still selling on a home game basis.
Is that why we're moving to 24-team playoff? So that you can claim that the regular season is actually a tournament to get into the tournament, and you can circumvent all of these laws and acts that we're talking about?
I mean, maybe that is the model where, instead of a 24 team playoff, where we end up at 128 team playoff, and we don't have a regular season. So, we could just sell that as our shared broadcasting right, and we don't have to worry about the SBA then because, granted, there's going to be a lot of schools that only have one game, but
Let's take it a step further. Let's make the group that runs the playoff also dictate the schedule of the regular season based on the previous year's performances. And you've got this laid out to say, hey, this team is already going to play this game. Like, in week 4 that it's going to be the 6th place finisher from last year versus the 7th place finisher. They're going to play it at this place. And all of a sudden, nobody's even involved in their own scheduling. And now you just got one entity that's running the whole thing.
Could potentially work, but I think that's where you start to really dig into, you start to really question, okay, is this something that needs to have the structure in order to exist at all? Because you get into step 3 of rule of reason and you say, is this the least restrictive way of doing it? And then you look at, well, why don't you just have a regular season? So probably wouldn't fly, but it's an interesting idea for sure.
Yeah, that would also require schools to be able to plan and execute a football road trip more than 20 years in advance, which is difficult for a lot of places. So,
yeah, how could we have college football without knowing who we're going to be playing in 2035?
Yeah, somebody wrote a proposal about that a couple of years ago. I could look it up again.
Who?
Oh, it's me.
Oh, that's who. Before we get to our unilateral decision, any final thoughts on the sports broadcasting agreement that we didn't touch on?
I'm saving it. I'm saving my bullet.
All right. Well, with that, we'll get into our unilateral decision of the day. We're saying you get to start from scratch. You're determining who gets to determine all these sports broadcasting rights, how they're done, what does your process look like, and who makes these final decisions?
Well, I'll start. I would, even with all these conversations, I would still keep it at the conference level. I think that the conference level is the right place for this to exist. It actually goes into a little bit of what we kind of just joked about, but the schedule setting, the ability to dictate kind of what this is going to look like, how you best position your league for competitive excellence and the ability to achieve at the national level. I think that those decision-making decisions need to kind of remain there and stay there. And I also am not an economist, just like you, but I'm going to pretend to be one. And I would be the one that says, no, I don't think it actually would help. I think that by pooling all the rights, you eliminate competition, which I think for these leagues is important. And I think that there are only so many groups that could afford what they think a pooled NCAA rights model would look like, that eventually you've only got a couple suitors. And eventually somebody's going to say, I'm not going to pay that much for this gigantic package. And yes, you can tier it out. But the minute you tier it out and you no longer have one of those major entities who is getting the best product, what they're willing to pay for the secondary product is probably not going to look the same as what it does right now. And so right now, when the secondary product is either the SEC or the Big Ten, however you want to look at that, that's still worth a significant amount of money to the group that gets to say, we have the premier package of that group. If you eliminate that opportunity, I think that you're eliminating the upside, and you're going to go to a system where basically the contracts are all on the same calendar. Whereas right now, you at least have to make networks make decisions about, okay, the ACC comes up in 2036. The SEC just came through. We didn't win that one. We have to win the next one if we want to stay on this plane. Like, there's some built-in competition of being able to do things on a different schedule, have different tiers. And again, the best tier of the Big Ten is comparable to the best tier of the SEC. And you can have two different entities who win those bids. Whereas if you pull them all together, I think that you start to lose the luster. And I don't know how much more money there really is, which I think is why the Big Ten and the SEC aren't necessarily on board with it, against not just having to share their revenue, but their pieces of the pie might even get smaller because the competition starts to go away. So I would leave it where it is. I think it is the best model. And that doesn't even take into account the Congress stuff and having to amend the SBA. I think that the way it is, even if you amended it, you would actually ultimately try to get back to the way it is right now because of the different ways that everybody gets to control what's important to them.
I think you put it really, really well. Like, I was prepared to come in here and make a fervent defense of revenue sharing and say that it'll help competitive balance. And I mean, that's only one piece of the puzzle. So I don't even know if it necessarily would, but honestly, after this whole discussion, I don't know if I can, because, you know, I did not think about the consumer issue. I didn't think about kind of connecting the dots between, you know, having one shared broadcast agreement and then having issues like we have in the NFL and Major League Baseball, where you have to have 6 different streaming subscriptions to watch all your games. And I'm not saying that doesn't already exist to a certain degree now in college sports. You know, especially if you have, you know, if you have non-conference games where all of a sudden, you know, because you're playing a school in the MAC, you know, you have to, you know, the games are under their agreement instead of your conference's agreement. The only kind of thing I would say is that I think to a certain degree I'd see, you know, the SEC and Big Ten's piece of the pie getting smaller as a feature instead of a bug, but that just may be my own pettiness and also just desire for more competitive balance. But again, it's one piece of the puzzle, so I'm not even sure it would even accomplish that goal, because yes, even if you're, you know, not giving Alabama $100 million in broadcast rights every year, they're still getting way more in donations than other schools.
To me, I think the most valuable property isn't a conference. It's the CFP. So if we're talking about true revenue sharing, pooling all these rights, I would assume the CFP could get rolled into that. And the way things work now, conference by conference, you know, you have a media partner paying for the primary rights. And that, in exchange for paying the most money, you get to come in and pick, you know, however many games off the top that are a part of your agreement. Whether that's 10, 20, 30, it doesn't matter. I think there's enough inventory when you pool everything together for the primary, secondary, tertiary, and so on, for there to be a ton of money involved, especially when you're including the CFP in that. Somebody's going to buy the championship game, and you're going to get first pick in, you know, the latter half of the season, and you're going to have the second pick. Like, you can split this up so much that I think there is enough inventory for the secondary rights and the tertiary rights to be way more valuable than they are right now, because now you're pooling the Big Ten, the SEC with the Big 12. And if the ACC is having a gigantic year and they're headed into this, like, you're getting to pull that game. I think there's enough there to do it. And I think it makes it way more valuable. It could make it more valuable for the SEC and the Big Ten, but they're going to be closing the gap for the other conferences. And that might not behoove them, even though it could be another, you know, 20 million plus in their pocket. So even though I think it could benefit them, it's just not going to benefit them as much as it benefits everybody else. And at that point, if it came to fruition, they probably want to take their ball and go home. I don't know if that makes sense for them or for all of college athletics. But I hear you, Mike, like keeping it at the conference level, but I think there's way more money to be had because of how much inventory is there and how they could split that pie up, especially when you include the CFP.
And if the CFP is going to run college football like we've talked about a few different times, I would change my tune. But yeah.
See, even among us non-economists, yes, it'll raise revenue. No, it won't raise revenue. Maybe.
Like all things we talk about on the show, it seems like an uphill battle, and it seems like a very layered thing that won't be figured out for many years to come. Either way, good luck to Cody Campbell. That's going to be fun. And the rest of you, thanks for watching. We'll see you on the next episode.